A problem we have with air is that air contains water. We call it humidity. All air contains water. We need to get that water out. We cannot have water being delivered to pneumatic instruments. So we need to get the water out of the air. If you took a typical, say, living room at 25 degrees C, 40% humidity, then that room would contain about half a cup of water just floating around in the air. If you've got all of that air and you compressed it, you've still got half a cup of water. That water needs to be got rid of. One way of getting rid of that water is by using a desiccant dryer. The way this works is it contains those little crystal-y things that you get in little sachets whenever you buy a new TV or when you buy wraps or something. They come in little packets, and their job is to dry stuff out. Now with this, what happens is the compressed air is fed in, and it goes into one side, goes through this, and ends up dry. Actually, maybe I'll draw a diagram on the side, that might be easier. Okay, so from the compressor, the air goes through there. It goes through, and it comes out of here, and it's dry. Then what we do is we take about 1/3 of the compressed air, and we blow it through the second one. And that comes out of there, and it just goes off to a silencer. This air here, this is what we're going to deliver to site. That goes off to site. So 2/3 of the air goes off to site. The rest of it goes through this tank here. See, the second tank is being regened. It's being regenerated or recycled. Because with that stuff you get in the little sachets, if you dry it back out, you can reuse it. So with a desiccant dryer, one of the cylinders is in use. The second cylinder is just being regenerated. And so you're blowing about 1/3 of the air straight through the second cylinder. Obviously, that means it's quite wasteful. You're wasting a lot of the air that you've created. So it is quite a wasteful system. It's also quite an expensive system to install. You're talking tens of thousands for this. If you get oil on the crystals, then they get poisoned. It turns into sort of like, well, it's like snot, to be honest, and it blocks it all up, and there's nothing you can do but flush it out and replace it. So they're very expensive to install. Refills are very expensive to buy, and it can be poisoned by oil. On the plus side, they're incredibly good at getting rid of water. You can almost guarantee that the air coming out of this will be completely dry. They're really, really effective. The other way of getting rid of water is to cool the air. See, water is quite a big fat molecule, and it really, really wants to drop to the ground. But what happens is small, fast-moving air molecules keep banging into it and pushing it back up. So these small, fast-moving air molecules keep pushing it back up like a juggler juggling balls. We have a name for the speed at which molecules move. There is something which describes the speed at which molecules move. Does anybody remember what the speed at which molecules move is? Hey, well done, Troy. Temperature. Temperature is actually the speed at which molecules move. If we can reduce the temperature, we reduce the speed. If you reduce the speed at which the air molecules move, the water molecules fall out. That's why whenever you cool something, water falls out. If you've got a cold glass, then the water in the air falls out of the air and drops onto the glass. We call it condensation. If you go out on a cold morning, you get condensation on your windscreen because the water falls out. I'm sure you're all experienced with air conditioners. When you run your air conditioning, as the air temperature reduces, the water falls out. So air conditioners constantly run with water. So an easy way of removing the water from the air is to cool it. This is a great system. Its one Achilles heel is that it won't run at less than 4 degrees C. Because if you start running at less than 4 degrees C, the water inside the thin pipes will start to freeze up. Of course, this doesn't really matter because there's not much water in the air at 4 degrees C, unless you're in a certain circumstance. If you have any kind of body of water, so here's a body of water, immediately above that body of water, in a kind of cloud, is 100% humidity. Now, that doesn't normally hang around very long, because normally the wind comes along and blows it away. However, if we had a windless day, so if we had no wind and the temperature drops, what happens is, as the temperature drops, that 100% humidity starts to form lots of tiny little water droplets. And the water droplets condense out, and they condense out on bits of dirt and bits of pollen. And so we end up with a cloud forming. So as temperature drops, on a windless day, a cloud will form above any body of water. Now, what is it that we call it when a cloud forms above a body of water on a cold morning? Yep, it's fog. Fog or mist. So we get fog or mist, just like it was in Perth today. And that's what happens if you have a windless day and the temperature drops. You get fog, and it just sits there. Well, that's not a problem, unless you happen to have built your compressor house. If you've built your compressor house next to your tailing bed, or next to the river, then what you're going to do is you're just going to suck that cloud in to your compressor house. If you've got a refrigerative dryer in there, because it's a cold morning, that refrigerative dryer will do absolutely nothing for you. And what you'll do is, you'll deliver compressed water. Compressed air plus water to your site. And all of the pneumatics will break down probably that day, if not a little bit later. You'll have problems all day long if you have a foggy day. So, refrigerative dryers are brilliant unless you're in a place that's prone to fog, which I guess would include oil rigs. The next thing we do to try and get rid of oil and water is filters. Filters and separators. So we've got some filters, we've got some carbon filters, some paper filters. We have filters and separators to try and get rid of the water and the oil. That's the next thing that should come along. Now, I'm being terribly cynical about all of this, but my experience has been that on a new installation, you get the compressor. And the air comes out of the compressor and goes to the dryer. And it comes out of the dryer and goes to the filter, or filters. And then it should be delivered. That's what happens on a new installation. Now, over time, what seems to happen is maybe the dryer breaks down and they can't be bothered getting a Frigy out. So what they do is they open up the bypass and they just bypass the dryer. Now that's fine, nothing goes badly wrong that day or in fact that week. Then the fitters get called out to the filters and he goes to the filters and he finds out the filters are all blocked up. And the reason they're all blocked up is because they're soaked. So they change the filters. And then they block up again, so they change them again. And then they block up again, and then they think, oh, I can't be bothered with this. So they bypass the filters. And nothing really badly goes wrong that day or that week, but then slowly, we start to get breakdowns. We start to get valves that don't open, things that break down, pneumatic instruments that don't read. So we start to get more and more breakdowns. And then over the course of the next 6 months, we get more breakdowns, especially if we start going into the winter and we start getting some fogs. And then what they do is they call out somebody like a systems analyst, and he comes along and says, well, the reason why it's all breaking down is because it's all full of water. And the reason why it's all full of water is because you don't have a dryer on. Inevitably at that point, somebody says, but we don't need the dryer. We switched it off 6 months ago and we don't need it. And it's one of those things, because the fault hasn't occurred immediately, people make this assumption that we didn't need it. Same with the filters. Because the fault didn't happen immediately, then people say, oh, well, we obviously didn't need that thing. So dryers and filters is something we have to watch the maintenance of. It has a tendency to slip. When it slips, it's us, the instrument people, who are going to end up suffering. Now, the next place the air is going to end up is a thing called an air receiver. An air receiver is a big old tank, and its job is to provide lots of volume, so that if a very big piston suddenly actuates, all the other valves don't open up because they've lost their air volume. So an air receiver is designed to provide volume. What you will see on an air receiver is a tide mark. And depending on the humidity and the temperature of the air in the room, you'll either get condensation above or below this tide mark. What the tide mark shows is the level of oil and water in that air receiver. You don't want that level to get too high. See, the air receiver is where the water will end up. We have a couple of ways of getting the water out of an air receiver. We've got a few options. You've got float-operated drains, which work just like the float switch on a toilet, or you've got intelligent drains, which work just like the float switch on a toilet, but it's also got a solenoid on it. The one thing that both of these have in common is that, almost without exception, they don't work very well. They always break down. The only thing which works really well and reliably is a manual tap. and an apprentice with a clipboard. And what happens is the apprentice goes round every day and opens up the manual tap and makes a little note of what came out. If he says, I was there for 15 minutes draining water out, then we need to talk to someone. If he says, oh, drained it today, loads of oil came out, well, that's a problem as well. Or drained it today, loads of little specks of carbon came out. Well, that sounds like something's breaking down inside the compressors. So the best system is an apprentice with a clipboard. All of these other things, float-operated drains, intelligent drains, sooner or later, they're going to break.